The Sons of Horus cemented their legacy, above all else, during the Great Crusade, a veritable slaughter where victory, vindication, and the seeds of discord were all sown. In the records of Imperial conquest, few campaigns stand as monumental as the Great Crusade, a military endeavor so vast, so decisive, so grandiose that its echoes still haunt the data stacks of Terra's deepest archives. To understand how this conflict reshaped the course of human destiny, one must first trace the final offensive against the orcs. In particular, the orc overlord known as Uruk, a warlord whose greenskin empire had choked the Ulnar sector in its totality for decades with a brutal efficiency that would not be seen again until the rise of the beast. Launched at the twilight of the 30th millennium and concluding at the cusp of the 31st, the Great Crusade was an operation of unprecedented scale and might. The Imperium committed no fewer, but potentially far more, than 100,000 Space Marines, accompanied by over 8 million Imperial Army personnel. They were then bolstered by thousands upon thousands of starships, their crews, and the requisite support element. These were not probing attacks or limited engagements. This was complete and total war, a conflict of total annihilation, unleashed upon the Xenos Empire that had entrenched itself deeply into the sector's key world. At the center of the storm were the Luna Wolves, first amongst equals who found themselves at all times right at the tip of the spear. It was they who were chosen to lead the final push into Uruk Fortress. At the campaign's very records confirm that the decisive moment came when Horus himself, accompanied by his elite Terminator guard from his first company, breached the inner sanctum of the Xenos tyrant. Amidst the crumbling grandeur of the Orcs' bastion, Horus confronted not just a warlord, but an entire cadre of 40 of the largest orc knobs, so large that they would give Gazgul Maguruk Draka a moment's hesitation. And without any pretense, the Primarch charged. His lightning claw tore through the mob in a frenzy of violence, carving a path straight through the green tide. That is until he stood face to face with Uruk, and the duel between the two was beyond belief. Uruk, for all his monstrous size and savagery, proved no match for the speed, precision, and intellect derived from the Primarch's inhuman biology. Once crippled, the Overlord was hoisted bloodily and hurled from the battlement of his very own fortress by Horus himself. His screams were lost in the din of battle below. As he splattered on the ground, his body barely just bouncing off the ground once, dead. The sight of this act broke the will of the greenskins. Leaderless and disoriented, the orcs faltered, attempting to retreat, only to find the outer walls of the fortress completely compromised by the Luna Wolves. The rout would then turn into massacre as thousands upon thousands of greenskins died where they stood, caught between the hammer of the Terminators and the anvil of the encircling Astartes forces. When the bloodletting ceased, silence seemed to reclaim the shattered palace. Horus surveyed the throne chamber itself, as every combatant, orc and Terminator alike, had perished, save one, the first captain, Ezekiel Abaddon. And he stood alone, wreathed in gore and encircled by the mangled corpses of his foes. His armor was beyond repair. His body was bloodied, but he stood firm. And that fact alone is often cited in internal commendation logs submitted following the battle. It is no coincidence that Abaddon's ascent began here. The Great Crusade became the symbolic pinnacle of the Great Crusade, as it was an undeniable demonstration of the Imperium's unmatched might and the triumph of its unified vision. The Orcs of Ulnar represented the most concentrated Xenos threat yet encountered, and their destruction marked the strategic victory for the Imperium of truly incredible value. But this victory, like many others, was rarely without a cost. Following the campaign, the Emperor departed the field of war for Terra, and he would go on to entrust the stewardship of the rest of the Crusade directly to Horus. With this shift came a seismic reordering of power. Horus was not only first amongst equals in thought alone, now his position factually above that of his brothers, as Horus was now elevated to the rank of Warmaster and placed in command not only of the Luna Wolves, but the entirety of the Imperial war machine, including his fellow Primarchs. This was not a suggestion, this was an Imperial decree. While many offered loyalty, like Sanguinius, some amongst the Primarchs struggled with the Emperor's absence. To them, he left them without sufficient explanation before retreating from the war in order to pursue a mysterious project deep within Terra's sanctum, all the while being cloaked in those vexing twins, secrecy and silence. The emotional rapture that would follow, and the perceived abandonment allowed veiled resentment to simmer to the surface, and it would in time fester into something far more dangerous. And yet, despite this mounting tension, the Emperor still sought to honor Horus, as words were sent from Terra that in recognition of his deeds at Olinor, the Luna Wolves were to be renamed as the Sons of Horus, a title meant to immortalize their Primarch's glory. In a telling gesture of humility, Horus would decline the honor, choosing instead to retain the Legion's name. That restraint perhaps was truly humility, or perhaps it was something else entirely. And it wouldn't be until Sanguinius convinced Horus that he had truly earned the right to have a Legion named after him that he would justly acquiesce to the Emperor's gift. Though the Luna Wolves carved their legacy in countless campaigns across the stars, no single triumph would so thoroughly redefine their identity or the fate of the Imperium as the Ulnar Crusade, for it was not merely a victory, but rather the apex of the Imperium's ambitions, as it was the largest coordinated military operation of its era, and its target was the most powerful Orc empire ever to have existed. However, even throughout the entirety of this campaign and having gained these honors, Horus is known to have commented that Sanguinius, it should have been him, that he had the strength and the vision to carry us to victory, and the wisdom to rule once victory was won. For all his aloof coolness, he alone has the Emperor's soul in his blood. Each of us carries a part of our father within us, whether it is his hunger for battle, his psychic talent, his determination to succeed. Sanguinius holds it all. It should have been his. This was in regards to his ascension to the rank of Warmaster. However, said words would not be unearthed until cycles later, and it was found out that they were never truly spoken aloud. However, they do offer a chilling lens into Horus's actions in the heresy, in particular his targeting of his brother Sanguinius and his fear of being replaced by him. As the Great Crusade returned to its surge across the stars once the Emperor had left for Terra, it brought with it not only conquests and compliance, but revelation. Amongst these most troubling truths unearthed during the expansion was the undeniable reality that the Primarchs, though engineered by humanity's paragon, bore within them the very weaknesses they were designed to rise above. Crafted by the Emperor himself to embody idolized aspects of humanity, the 20 Gene Sons were most definitely godlike in both mind and form, but yet beneath their transhuman veneer, these beings carried the shadow of their predecessors: pride, ambition, envy, fear, jealousy, a hunger for purpose and recognition. These were not accidents of design, but rather failures of control. They were not machines, they were sons, and like any other son, at their core, they were only human, after all. It was during this pivotal era after the triumph of Olinor that these fractures and weaknesses grew harder and harder still to ignore. With Horus Lupercal elevated to the rank of Warmaster, command of the Great Crusade had directly passed from the Emperor's hand to his son. Horus embraced this burden with the fervor of a favored son. His tactical genius and charisma inspired legions across the galaxy, and for a time, it seemed the transition would hold. But unrest brewed beneath the surface. The Emperor's sudden withdrawal from the front lines, coupled with his silence regarding the nature of his work on Terra, did indeed leave a vacuum, not of leadership, but of trust. The newly found Council of Terra was also a sticking point, as it was established to oversee the Imperium's political administration in his absence, and it would be led by the Emperor's regent, Malcador the Sigillite. But also it would be controlled by the mere humans who required transhumans to survive. To the Primarchs, this was not just bureaucratic restructuring, it was an active and intentional exclusion. For some, it seemed like a betrayal, as dissension soon rippled through the ranks of the Primarchs. Brother turned from brother, but not with word or blade, but rather doubt. The unity of the Space Marine Legions, once forged in the fires of the Unification Wars and tempered by the Great Crusade, now strained beneath the weight of questions left unanswered. Not all chose the path of patience. Amidst the turmoil, one name stood out above the others: Lorgar Aurelian. Publicly, the word-bearer's Primarch appeared utterly and unquestionably loyal. Privately, however, his mind churned with theology, ambition, and Machiavellian schemes. Lorgar, ever devoted to higher powers, almost by design, be they divine or imperial, aligned himself with Horus during the period of his rising discord. Whether out of faith or calculation, potentially even a deeper allegiance yet to be revealed, his support would be pivotal in what was to come, as records show that only a handful of Primarchs stood with Horus during these tense days by choice. Most suffered in silence, harboring resentment in solitude. Yet a select few, like Lorgar, watched closely. The Warmaster had taken command, but the fault lines beneath his authority had already begun to shift, crack, crumble, and break. And in the halls of the Imperium, echoes of a coming fracture and the potential need to eliminate the Astartes and the Primarchs could already be heard. What seemed to truly claw at the ire of the Astartes was that the Council of Terra was hastily formed and populated by nobles and bureaucrats rather than warriors, who instituted sweeping reforms aimed at consolidating imperial administration rather than consolidating the order of the worlds being integrated into the Imperium. These included severe and harsh tax policies imposed upon newly compliant worlds won with harsh conflict along with blood and toil of the legions. To Horus, such decrees were not just short-sighted, as many of these worlds had been incredibly depleted of resources during their defiance, but they were also personal affronts. He viewed these decisions as betrayals of the ideals for which he and his brothers, along with their sons, had bled across the stars. Yet it was not mere policy that wounded him the most. The Emperor, his father, creator, and liege, had abandoned the front lines without explanation, retreating to Terra to labor in secret upon a mysterious undertaking which would only later be known as the Webway Project. Even to Horus, his most favored and trusted of sons, the Emperor revealed absolutely nothing. And this silence, mixed with the creation and the accumulation of power that was the Council of Terra, wounded Horus's heart deeply. Once brimming with loyalty and pride, there took root the quiet ache of perceived failure, and something far, far darker. The creeping resentment of a child cast aside. It was upon the corrupted moon of Davin that this internal fracture became irreversible. The Sons of Horus had returned to Davin for the second time in 60 standard years. During their earlier campaigns, they had successfully achieved, or at least it seemed, the imperial compliance of the world. A detachment of word bearers under the command of First Captain Cor Ferron had been entrusted with the planet's integration, and it was at the suggestion of First Chaplain Erebus that the Luna Wolves had adopted the natives' institution of warrior lodges, fraternal orders supposedly rooted in camaraderie, yet cloaked in secrecy. These lodges would become the quiet mechanism of corruption from legion to legion. Unknown to Horus, the seemingly benign social structures had already been twisted into conduits of chaos's influence. Behind the scenes stood Lorgar Aurelian, Primarch of the Word Bearers, the devout sons of Cloichus, a world that had been saturated in religious fanaticism. Lorgar had long sought to deify the Emperor, an act which had drawn his father's unforgiving wrath. The Emperor, espousing the Imperial Truth, denounced all forms of religion, even those deifying him, demanding that humanity place its faith in science and reason alone. When Lorgar's fervor culminated in the construction of massive temples to the Emperor's divinity, most notably on the world of Kur, the punishment had been swift, merciless, and cold. The Word-Bearers Legion was actively castigated and humiliated, cast down by the Ultramarines at the Emperor's order. Lorgar, wounded and furious, began his fateful pilgrimage to uncover divinity worthy of worship elsewhere. And what he found in the warp. Lorgar bent the knee, and the Word-Bearers followed shortly thereafter. And from that moment on, a single directive would echo throughout their ranks: corrupt the legions, beginning with that of Horus. The warrior lodges, once tools of brotherhood, had now become pipelines of heresy. Erebus and Lorgar, along with Cor Ferron, through deception and ancient blasphemy, had opened the first gate, and through that gate, the fall of the Warmaster would begin. Of the countless war zones and broken worlds that bear the scars of the Great Crusade, few are spoken in such quiet and bitter tones as the Akum Sloth Cluster, a seemingly secure territory brought into imperial compliance during the early years of the Sons of Horus's forays into the Great Crusade. The cluster, seemingly out of nowhere, had erupted into open rebellion during the closing decades of the Great Crusade, under circumstances that continue to provoke scrutiny amongst Imperial scholars and military tacticians alike. Intelligence recovered during this insurrection indicated that the true instigators were not men but Xenos, a parasitic breed that had infiltrated the political elite and installed themselves within the bodies of the ruling class, going so far as to direct the cluster's subversion from within. These alien hosts would come to be known as the Unsighted Kings. Warmaster Horus Lupercal, ever mindful of infrastructure and future utility, devised a rather bold plan. Instead of committing to a long attrition campaign, he envisioned a swift and overwhelming strike, combining the assault of no fewer than 4 legions in a single decisive stroke. Those said legions would be the Sons of Horus, the Iron Warriors, the Space Wolves, and the Raven Guard. The objective was the fortified sanctuary of the Unsighted Kings, a central bastion buried within the strongest of the rebels' holds. Once it was taken, Horus believed the alien influence could be broken in a single decapitating blow. Though he expressed concern, Corvus Corax, Primarch of the Raven Guard, submitted to the Warmaster's command. He selected from amongst his forces the most seasoned of warriors, in particular Terran-born veterans of the earliest days of the 19th Legion. Notably, these were individuals who had voiced their agreement with Horus's plan, as they were to be assigned to the forefront of the assault. As the battle unfolded, what was meant to be a calculated and decisive strike descended into pure and unremitted chaos. The defenders, bolstered by the Xenos' control and a strangely similar ability to that of the Tau Ethereals, resisted with a ferocious, almost supernaturally driven resolve. And it was through this that the Raven Guard's vanguard was almost utterly decimated. Entire assault companies were reduced to tatters as communication faltered and ammunition ran dry. At the height of this crisis, with the breach failing and casualty rates rising to unsustainable levels, Corax himself would enter the fray directly, leading a final plan, a veritable desperate push, a forlorn hope in order to have his legion's resolve reignited. His battle cry over the Voxnet cut through the tantamount despair like a blade. The Raven Guard would then surge forward with a renewed fury, and Gate 42, the linchpin in the enemy's defense, would finally be seized. The Unsighted Kings were now cornered. Horus, wielding the authority of Warmaster, claimed the right to the final strike. At the moment of their destruction, the Xenos' psychic grip upon the minds of the cluster's population was shattered, proving the Warmaster's strategic assumption correct. The worlds of Akum Soth were rich in infrastructure and industrial potential. Having not engaged in a protracted siege, they were quickly reclaimed and reintegrated into the Imperium with minimal collateral damage to key assets. Yet the price remains written in the blood of the Raven Guard. Thousands upon thousands perished in the assault, most of them being Terran-born warriors who had served since the dawn of the Legion. Though the strategic objectives had been achieved, the operational toll raised questions. In particular, why were the 19th's oldest veterans placed so deliberately at the tip of the spear? Was this out of tactical necessity, or was it, like Corvus Corax's earlier exile of segments of his own legion, intentionally done out of political expedience? These inquiries remain unanswered, and the Akum Soth cluster would be fully reintegrated into the Imperium, having fulfilled the Warmaster's vision. However, this did lead to some doubts within members of the Raven Guard, in particular about how some of their brothers had been so needlessly sacrificed. The next moment of galactic import that would occur would be in the 203rd year of the Great Crusade, and this would turn the course of history seemingly by chance upon the discovery of a single defiant world. This was 6319, a planet lost to Imperial records, completely and utterly isolated by a warp anomaly, that is until the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet, driven off course by an unexpected warp storm, stumbled upon it. The system held 9 planets orbiting a stable yellow sun, and it was on the third world, known as 6319, that a remarkably advanced human civilization had taken root, one ruled by a figure who styled himself as the Emperor of Mankind. This pretender claimed divine right and galactic manifest destiny, declaring himself the one true ruler of the scattered remnants of humanity. To the Warmaster's fleet, he sent a message, not of defiance, but of summons, a request for parley and recognition of his sovereignty. In an act of measured diplomacy, Horus dispatched his favorite commander, Captain Hastur Senjaris of the Mournival, accompanied by his elite Glory Squad. The initial meeting appeared to proceed without incident, yet negotiations collapsed with a shocking swiftness. When Hastur spoke of another emperor, the Emperor Pretender took it as heresy, verbally stating it as such, leading to the diplomatic being slaughtered, thanks to being unarmed and unaware. Hastur's death deeply shook Horus, as it was not only the loss of his trusted officer, but as a personal wound, as he was truly the favored son of Horus Lupercal. And while he did not immediately retaliate, the Warmaster actually did, in fact, act with a chilling amount of restraint. A rapid response, Astartes' spear tip, was mobilized, but it was held in reserve, pending a second diplomatic effort. Mulgust, equerry to the Warmaster, was sent with a secondary envoy. That effort too ended in disaster, as Mulgust Stormbird was shot down in atmosphere, its wreckage scattered, and its passengers presumed dead. What followed was the largest display of force in the early years of the Great Crusade. Over 600 Imperial warships advanced on the system, and they were answered by a planetary fleet rising from 6319 itself. The ensuing battle is a ghost in the records of the Imperium, the exact details lost, redacted, or never fully recorded. What is known is the Imperium emerged victorious, and on the surface, Captain Ezekiel Abaddon had led the ground assault, ingratiating himself to Horus Lupercal, as the Sons of Horus had been deployed en masse, supported by a demi-maniple of Titans, escorted by close air support. Their objective had been to capture the city's core, and the Sons of Horus breached the walls rather quickly, advancing on the throne room, where the so-called Emperor offered to surrender, but only to Horus himself. This was an incident where Gabriel Loken, acting commander of the 10th Company, sensed a large amount of deception. Much like he would later sense it, the demand was, to him, obviously not a formality, but rather it was a trap meant to lure Horus into a kill zone, as then the Kulturan Reavers under Captain Kalos Ekerdon executed the man before he could act. But this deception ran far deeper, as the true false emperor revealed himself, striking down multiple Luna wolves in a manner that quite frankly resembled more of the gap in strength between a Primarch and a Space Marine than that between any Xenos and an Astartes, as he would go on to also severely wound both Gabriel Loken and Ekerdon in melee combat. The tide would only turn when Horus directly intervened, teleporting directly into the chamber, as rather than confront the imposter, the Primarch ended his life with a single shot of a combi bolter. With the death of the false emperor, the planetary resistance fragmented. However, pockets of loyal militia and planetary guard would continue to fight on 6319 and across the worlds in the system. It fell to Byzant Janus and a disciplined segment of Imperial Army regiments attached to the fleet to finish the job. One such campaign took place in the Whispered Mountains in the southern hemisphere of the world. This was an operation that would take 3 months to resolve, under the command of Loken's 10th Company, and it was in those mountains that the strange turned into the unthinkable. The final fortress was hewn directly into stone of the highest peak of the world, and it was held not by defenders, but rather by crude religious fanatics, as ancient shrines saturated with pre-imperial superstition. At its center was a name, Samus, one which no historical nor Xenos record matched, but the entity seemed quite real, as during the breach, a sergeant of the 10th Company was possessed by this warp being, and through him, Samus was made manifest. In the resulting chaos, over a dozen Astartes and multiple remembrancers were slaughtered. The horror would only be ended with the combined firepower of Captain Loken and Sergeant Nerovipus, as over 90 bolter rounds were spent, followed by multiple canisters of purifying flame in order to eliminate this threat. This would be the first time in recorded history that a warp entity was confirmed to be able to possess an Astartes. The implications of it were staggering. and it was classified at the highest level. Horus himself ordered those records sealed from everyone, including his brothers. The very truth that even the Space Marines could be turned against humanity was too dangerous to reveal. In the aftermath of this, planetary governance was transferred to General Rikas of the Byzant Janissaries, as civil restructuring fell to Egon, and 6319 was fully brought into heel and entered the Imperial fold. But its legacy would rear its ugly head at the cusp of the heresy, when more and more Astartes were being influenced by beings of the warp, much like Samus. The next episode of Galactic Precedents that would involve the Luna Wolves would be during the costly compliance of a world designated as 14020, a brutal campaign etched into Imperial records with a far simpler name, murder. The death world of Ulzrash was not marked on any Imperial chart when the 140th Expeditionary Fleet, under the command of Captain Kaitas Forum of the 9th Legion, the Blood Angels, entered its orbit. Awaiting them were ancient satellite beacons unknown to Imperial Auspex systems. Their warnings lost in translation, and unbeknownst to the fleet, these were relics that belonged to the Intrex, a highly advanced human civilization that had worked with Xenos in order to advance at a higher rate. And the message they had was rather direct, at least to those who could understand it. Stay away. The Intrex had designated Ulzrich as a sealed quarantine zone for a deadly Xenos race known only to them, but Captain Frem, unaware of the beacon's meaning, proceeded with standard compliance protocols, as 3 full companies of Blood Angels began atmospheric descent only to be cast far off course by the planet's near impenetrable storms. Communications fractured, Vox chatter would be broken into static, as Imperial forces found themselves scattered and isolated. Then the siege began. Initial surface reports were garbled and desperate, described their opponents as arachnoid creatures of considerable size and intelligence, who were relentless in both numbers and were fatally efficient. These beings were known as the Megarachnid, and Ulrich was designed to be a planetary prison for them. It was later learned that the Intrex had once warred with the Megarachnid, but in a rare act of mercy had chosen to exile them rather than extermination. Ulrich was said exile, as the species was stripped of spaceflight capability and contained within the world through the use of an artificial storm shell, generated by towering atmospheric disruptors disguised as massive organic trees. The Megarachnids had in essence been entombed in a prison without walls. However, the glorious Blood Angels were not privy to the situation, and it rapidly deteriorated. Isolated squads began to fall as survivors broadcast their final words with grim clarity. In his final transmission, Captain Frem said only 4 words: "This world is murder," and the name would endure. Responding to the distress calls, a company of Emperor's Children of the 3rd Legion entered the atmosphere, only to repeat the Blood Angels' errors. They too were utterly and irrevocably dispersed away from each other due to the world's violent winds, and then ambushed by the Xenos swarms. Their casualties mounted swiftly as the fleet loomed ever on the precipice. Then came the Luna Wolves, as 10 companies of the Sons of Horus Legion, drawn from the Warmaster's 63rd Expeditionary Fleet, arrived in full force to support the legions with the aid of the Imperial Army's Byzantine Janissaries, along with a contingent of Legio Mortis Titans, and they struck through the atmospheric veil with a force and coordination unknown to the Xenos within. Pushing into the dense biochemical forests of murder, every tree they destroyed peeled back the storm's curtain, allowing greater and greater cohesions from Imperial forces. It was due to this, along with the Primarchs joining in the war zone, that the campaign would turn. The Warmaster observed from offensive orbit upon the vengeful spirit, reportedly pleased with the relentless progress. A withdrawal was considered for a time. That was until an unexpected arrival changed the equation. Primarch Sanguinius, the angelic and beatific genusire of the Blood Angels, descended upon the surface to recover the remains of his fallen sons, with a natural and righteous anger that would put any that Angron had ever felt due to the butcher's nails to shame. As he emerged from the burning red dust with tears in his eyes and a question for his brother, "Will you join me in avenging them?" Horus' reply was simple, and it displayed the implicit trust he had in Sanguinius. Yes, let us murder. With 5 additional companies of Blood Angels committed, the Imperial forces surged as the 2 Primarchs would surge across the planet. As the Megarachnids, without the ability to retreat or true fear, the Megarachnids started to notice that the tides were turning, as even though their numbers were nigh inexhaustible, there would eventually be a limit, as thousands of the Xenos emerged from the canyons and burrows in order to stem the Imperial onslaught. But their efforts, though valorous in a twisted sense, proved utterly futile. By the 6th month of the sustained combat, the Megarachnids stood on the edge of existence. Then, once again, salvation emerged from an unlikely source. The full fleet of the Interax entered the system. Their purpose was not war, but inquiry, to discover who had disturbed their ancient prison. The arrival of these advanced humans presented an entirely different diplomatic challenge. Horus ordered the campaign on murder to be halted, and the forces of the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet shifted instantly from the eradication of the Megarachnids to first direct contact with the Interax, and thus the first tumbling of the domino that would eventually turn the Warmaster. This would lead to the eventual fall of the Interax, which would give the Wordbearers a chance at a great prize that would eventually be what turned the Warmaster. And it would be during the later years of the Great Crusade, just prior to the opening salvos of what would become the Horus Heresy, that the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet encountered a culture unlike any previously categorized or cataloged by the Imperium. They were human and technologically advanced, while being philosophically distinct and most notably not alone, as this civilization was known as the Interact. Operating from the capital world known as Zenobia, the Interact had developed in concert with several Xeno species, most notably the Kinnerbach, a sentient ape-like race with a mastery of metallurgy and energy manipulation unlike any they had ever seen. Together they had forged a delicate but formidable alliance that had weathered countless conflicts and centuries of strife. Amongst their most defining characteristics, however, was the vigilant opposition to the forces they referred to as Chaos, what the Imperium knows now as the Warp's most malignant entities, the Chaos Gods. By the time first contact was made, the Interax had already developed a mature understanding of the Warp's corrupting influence. That made them rather cautious and perhaps even hostile towards strangers arriving from the stars bearing symbols of a golden Imperium. While diplomacy was initiated by the Warmaster, as he descended to parley alongside the members of his inner circle, the Mournival, the Interax themselves, though courteous, suspected that the Imperials might be servants, wittingly or not, of forces they had spent millennia opposing. And then something happened that would shatter the peace. Within the hollowed chambers of the Hall of Devices, a museum and sacred repository of arcane artifacts, many of which had been seized or quarantined in order to prevent the spread of Chaos's influence, an event unfolded that would send both the Interax and the Imperium spiraling towards conflict. First Chaplain Erebus of the Wordbearers Legion, an Astartes of considerable influence, and the secret acolyte of the ruinous powers, took it upon himself to infiltrate the hall under the cover of diplomatic immunity. There he located and stole a weapon of immense historical and metaphysical significance, the Anathane, a cursed, corrupted, warp-tainted blade forged by the Kinnerbach, and once used in rituals by cults of Nurgle, the plague god. But Erebus did not merely steal the relic, he destroyed the evidence of his theft. Before escaping, he rigged the hall to explode, obliterating countless priceless artifacts and killing multiple Interax guards, leaving behind a scene carefully crafted to implicate the Imperium as saboteurs and servants of chaos. When the explosion racked Zenobia, the Interax responded with immediate military force. A world once open to dialogue had now been turned into a battlefield, thanks to the ever-hated first chaplain Erebus. The Luna Wolves, taken by surprise and utterly unaware of Erebus's treachery, found themselves besieged on all sides. The diplomatic facade shattered, left the Warmaster to be forcefully extracted from under fire. The Astartes retaliated with the full fury of the Legion. The conflict itself escalated with a swift and bloody finality. Though the battle itself was brief, the consequences of them were profound, as the anatheme, now in Erebus' possession, would resurface again, this time on the moon of Davin, where it would deal the wound that had opened Horus' soul to the whispers of the warp. That cursed relic, taken from the museum on Zenobia, would become a blade that symbolically and physically began the fall of the Warmaster, and led the Interacts to being misled and seeing the Imperium as emissaries of damnation, leading them to be marked for destruction. In the years that followed, the Imperium would launch a strategic campaign of annihilation. Every known Interacts world would be reduced to ash, as no formal accounts of these campaigns' aftermath would ever be released by the Adeptus Administratum, and no surviving Interacts emissaries would ever be presented to Imperial diplomacy again. What knowledge they held, what warnings they might have had, all due to pure serendipity occurring thanks to the incidents on murder. Then one theft, one lie, and one blade, and with it a fracture in fate that may have damned the galaxy to endless years of civil war. By the dawning of the 31st millennium, 60 Terran years had passed since the world of Davin was brought under Imperial compliance. Official records classified the system as stable, pacified, productive, and loyal. But records, like anything else, can lie, or worse, be rewritten in order to obfuscate the truth. The truth itself would be returned in 004 M31 in the form of a single name whispered by a rather familiar voice to the Imperium, Eugene Temba. It was thanks to First Chaplain Erebus of the Word Bearers, a known confidant of the Warmaster, that the troubling news was brought to Horus. He claimed that Temba, the appointed Imperial Governor of Davin, had renounced the Emperor and broken his oaths. Most alarmingly, Erebus alleged that Temba had failed in a military operation to pacify the feral tribes inhabiting Davin's moons. According to this account, during a parley with the moon's natives, Temba and his garrison were struck by some warp-born sorcery, and their loyalty crumbled as they were corrupted with promises of immortality and power, corrupted by a being who Horus had no idea was Nurgle. At this, the Warmaster did not hesitate even for the merest moment. The combined Imperial strike force, comprising of elements of the Luna Wolves, the Byzantine Janizars, and a detachment of Legio Mortis, would be deployed to Davin's moon's surface. There they found the wreckage of Temba's flagship, the Glory of Terra, reduced to a bloated and rustling corpse of metal. Near the swamps surrounding the crash site, they uncovered a mass grave as scores of decomposing bodies, still clad in the tatters of the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet's uniforms, rested there. But this was no mere resting place, as the cadavers quickly rose, reanimated by Nurgle's foul breath. The garrison was now an army of plague zombies, their corpses animated by the filth and warp energy of Nurgle's design. The Sons of Horus and their allies would quickly cut them down in brutal combat, purging the stumbling hosts with fire and blade. Then the Warmaster pressed forward, as Horus personally spearheaded the assault itself on the hulk of the rotting Glory of Terra. Inside, amongst the dripping decks and rusted corridors, Captain Vera Moy of the 19th Company made contact with what had once been Eugene Temba. The figure they found was not human, at least not in any conventional way. Bloated beyond recognition, Temba's form was grotesquely swollen, his flesh riddled with mutation, and his soul drowned in Nurgle's rot. Yet it was not just the transformation that disturbed Captain Moy, it was a blade Temba now carried. The anatheme, the implement forged by the Xenos Kinnerbrock, is metallurgical technology utterly forbidden even by the Interacts. The anatheme was a weapon attuned to one target, a creation steeped in malice bound by the will of Nurgle. Weeks earlier, this had been the same blade that had been stolen from the Hall of Devices. Sometime earlier, this had been the device that had initiated the conflict between the Interacts on Zenobia and the Imperium. And it seemed somewhat clear to the Luna Wolves upon the planet that the thief had been Erebus. With an impossible speed and skill, Temba struck. Moy resisted the governor's attempts at conversion as much as he could, in an attempt to maybe spread the message of what he had understood. Unfortunately, he was slain. Horus arrived shortly thereafter, and what followed was a duel that would alter the course of human history. Despite Temba's bloated form, he moved with a shocking agility and precision, bladesmanship entirely foreign to the man Horus had once known, was possessed by this foul beast, as every strike tested the Warmaster's nigh infinite battle prowess, as it was not Temba's strength, but rather that of the anathema that gave the corrupted governor this edge, as it was designed to harm its victim at a molecular level, allowing the blade to bypass any armor and cut through any defenses, leading Horus to be struck deep. Horus was wounded critically, as his shoulder was pierced straight through, thanks to his power armor failing him. But in the end, he prevailed. The corrupted Temba would collapse, and in a final moment, clarity returned. Racked by guilt and torment, Temba attempted to confess what had occurred, but he was only able to give the merest of warnings. Only you, Horus, can stop it. A future of death, where the Emperor is a corpse bound in gold, and mankind is chained in madness. Then silence as Temba's soul was consumed by the warp. Horus, bleeding and broken, was retrieved and brought back to the flagship. No apothecary, no medicae, it seemed, to cure what now festered within his body. The anathema had done more than pierce his flesh, as it had infected the Warmaster. With a curse no science could mend, and so Erebus returned with another suggestion. In violation of Imperial Truth, Horus would be brought to the priests of the Serpent Lodge, a cult disguised as a healing sect, rooted in Davin's ancient past. Under the guise of salvation, the dark gods would complete their work. Sorcery had been banned since Nicaea, and it would be what was used to reach Horus's soul, as they would not merely heal his body, they tainted his heart, fed him visions, instilled endless jealousy, resentment, and a supernatural ache of abandonment, all the while instilling an image of the Emperor who would leave him behind, as history would show us that in the shadowed temples of the Serpent's Lodge, deep within the cursed soil of Davin's moon, humanity's fate was eternally rewritten. After having been grievously wounded and tainted by the anathema, First Captain Erebus, architect of treachery, guided the desperate members of the Sons of Horus Legion to make a fatal decision, one that would lead to Horus meeting with the dark gods in his dreamscape, where they portrayed themselves as wronged beings, persecuted by the Emperor's psychic tyranny, as they forever cloak their intentions in honeyed lies, insisting that they had no desire to influence the material realm. Yet even within the depths of chaos, a voice had warningly cried out, Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Suns. This was another one of his great failures, as he had entered the warp in order to intercept Horus's journey, and he revealed to Horus what he had seen was merely one possible future, a future Magnus insisted they could have averted, but Horus had already been consumed by resentment and the influence of the Chaos Gods. Their offer was, to him, irresistible. Their pact was chilling in its simplicity. Give us the Emperor and we will give you the galaxy. Driven by the instilled jealousy, embitterment, and the perceived betrayal, he was seduced by the promises of ultimate unlimited power, leading Horus to accept the pact. The gods healed him and infused him with a profane might manyfold his original. And in that very moment, the favored son of the Emperor renounced his oath. Thus the Luna Wolves were no more, and they were reborn, bound to Chaos Undivided, despite their refusal to accept that they had been bound to the Chaos Gods. This caused Magnus to see Horus's future betrayal, meaning that he would act in a desperate attempt to alert the Emperor, casting a psychic warning directly to Terra, but this would be truly catastrophic, and all within the plans of the Chaos Gods. The psychic blast itself tore through the Emperor's carefully placed wards, shattering what had protected not only the throne world, but a secret project buried deep within the dungeons of his personal palace, his attempt to build a human-accessible ascension into the webway. The Emperor had been unaware of Horus's corruption, and only saw Magnus's defiance of the Council of Nicaea. Ordering his capture, he dispatched Leman Russ and the Space Wolves, flanked by a cadre of the Sisters of Silence, to bring Magnus to Terra Terra to answer for his crimes. Yet treachery was compounded furthermore by treachery. As they were en route to Prospero, Horus intercepted and deceived Russ as he exploited Russ's already building hate of Magnus, and he urged him that the Emperor had changed his mind, something which is honestly unthinkable, that the Wolf King was not to arrest Magnus, but to destroy him. Fueled by his own disdain for sorcery and convinced that the universe would be better left without Magnus, Russ decided to fully play into the self-appointed role as the Emperor's executioner, launching a full-scale assault upon the Thousand Sons' homeworld. Thus, despite the fact that Magnus had not only attempted to aid Horus from falling to chaos, and attempted to submit himself willingly to Imperial judgment upon realizing he had been manipulated, the road to damnation began to burn from all directions. Eventually, from this would be birthed the first official blow of the heresy, Isstvan III, which would forever be marked in Imperial history as the Isstvan III atrocity.